For regular videos on ancient cultures and forgotten civilizations, please subscribe. YouTube is filled with videos dealing with the legend of the lost city of Atlantis. And why not? It's a subject that has fascinated people for more than 2,000 years. One series of videos that has gotten more than the usual amount of attention here on YouTube is that of Jimmy Corsetti from the Bright Insight channel. In them, Bright relates the theory that the Richat structure, aka the Eye of the Sahara, in the Adrar region of Mauritania, is the most likely location for the site of Atlantis. The premise did not originate with him, but Corsetti has made it famous. He has even been on the Joe Rogan Experience to promote the idea. As a historian of antiquity, I am particularly interested in these kinds of topics, so I wanted to offer my thoughts on the proposals propounded on Bright Insight. Unfortunately, there are weaknesses in the arguments made, and even several errors of fact that injure the theory considerably. So, is Atlantis to be found in Mauritania? Back in 2019, I made a video on Atlantis, looking closely at the notion that the Richat structure was the location of its capital city. It was my very first video. At that time, the Bright Insight channel had made 3 full-length videos on the subject. They were The Lost City of Atlantis, Hidden in Plain Sight, The Lost City of Atlantis, Hidden in Plain Sight Part 2, and Ancient Map proves the lost city of Atlantis is the Eye of the Sahara. Since that time, Bright Insight has made 3 more full-length videos. Secret Files on the Eye of the Sahara and the Lost Ancient City of Atlantis. Proof Sahara Desert was blasted by ocean 12,000 years ago. And Lost Roman Map has Atlantis at Eye of Sahara, Africa. These videos contain some new arguments and even some responses to my original reservations, so I thought it was worth returning to the subject to consider this new material. The present video is an update of my original 2-parter, containing both the bulk of the original plus new content added in at various points along the way. In fact, quite a bit of new content. Jimmy's new videos contain numerous recaps and summaries and repetitions, so I will be including just the pertinent new material. I encourage you to go watch them all so that you can check to make sure I am not misrepresenting anything that Corsetti says. He's not the originator of some of the main arguments he presents. He properly attributes most of them to a documentary made back in 2011 by George S. Alexander and Natalis Rosen called Visiting Atlantis, which is on the Gaia website. I went back to that video to see if Corsetti changed anything and to get the full arguments behind the theory that the Eye of the Sahara was Atlantis. The video is behind a paywall, so you can't watch it without subscribing to the website, so I will address its arguments for you here. But Jimmy does have some arguments of his own as well. To be fair to Jimmy, I would like to show you what he says at the end of his 3rd video on the subject, so that you understand where he's coming from.
Let me just say that I have not discovered anything. I only discovered a little-known documentary on the topic of Atlantis, and I am simply sharing that information with as many people as I possibly can. And that is the purpose of this channel. I have no desire to have something published in some scientific journal. That's for other nerds. I'm a different type of nerd. And nerd is a term of endearment, by the way, for me. My desire is to share information that I find interesting or important with the masses, and I will be discussing many different topics on this channel. And in the future, I will even be remaking certain videos I have now that already have millions of views, as I'm trying to build the quality of this channel, and some of those videos, just the presentation, various inaccuracies in the information, the editing, there's just a lot of room for improvement, so look forward to that. And keep in mind, I do 100% of this myself, and I'm learning as I go.
Taking him at his word, we will go forward under the assumption that he's presenting this theory merely as a matter of interest and curiosity, and that he's open-minded and not dogmatic about any of it. I think that by the end of this video, even Jimmy Corsetti himself will realize this is an idea he needs to let go of. I say that with the assumption that he is sincere in his beliefs, and that in the face of convincing evidence to the contrary, he is able to change his mind. But at the very least, I hope that this video will prove helpful to you. Please keep in mind that this video is not designed to malign anyone's character, whether that be Jimmy Corsetti or George Alexander or anyone else. It is a discussion about the feasibility of the idea that the Richat structure was the location of Atlantis. And we're playing clips from the most influential proponents of this thesis as a way to cite the arguments. Consideration of subjects like these gives us an opportunity to find out why archaeologists and historians come to the conclusions that they do. And heck, I just love talking about ancient history, so let's go! Although my study of ancient history includes examination of a significant amount of archaeological findings, it can't help but do so. As a trained historian and not a professional archaeologist, most of my work deals with ancient documents. And so, I feel comfortable talking about the historical writings referenced by Bright Insight, the most notable of which is Plato, our main source of information on Atlantis. I have a full discussion of the writings of Plato about Atlantis in my video, Atlantis, the Ultimate Guide, which I encourage you to watch. So let me just give you the basics here. Plato, as you may know, was a Greek philosopher who lived in the late 5th and early 4th centuries BCE. We have quite a few of his philosophical dialogues. His writings on Atlantis come from two of his later dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. The Timaeus is concerned with the proper running of a state. One of its characters lays out a cosmological myth. It talks about the creation of the world by a demiurge, which is a kind of craftsman god, and an analysis of what the Greeks believed were the four elements, earth, wind, fire, and water. The Critias is an unfinished sequel to the Timaeus. These works, which are about 2,400 years old, are the oldest sources we have on Atlantis. There is nothing older, but Bright Insight and his source, Alexander, claim that the information about Atlantis is older than Plato.
Many people are not even aware that the information contained in Plato's writings of Atlantis actually originate from the ancient Egyptians.
The Egyptians? How does he arrive at this conclusion?
Plato received all the information about Atlantis from Solon, who was his ancestral relative separated by 6 generations.
Solon was an Athenian aristocrat and statesman who lived about 2 centuries before Plato. Today we possess some fragments of Solon's poetry, but none of these mention Atlantis. So we can't verify the statement made in Plato. Now you may say, even if Solon did tell the story of Atlantis, that's still only 200 years before Plato, so it doesn't really get us that much further back in history. But then they make the case that Solon, in turn, got his information from a yet earlier source.
In Solon's later years, he traveled to Egypt in the search of knowledge, and Egypt at that time had the longest documented historical records available. And he visited Neph's temple at Sais, where he learned of the history of Atlantis from a high Egyptian priest who translated the hieroglyphs that were carved into stone within the temple, which also described that Egypt was once a colony of the empire of Atlantis.
This temple of Neith at Sais no longer exists, so we can't go to Egypt to corroborate this tale. According to Plato's writings, there are several claims this priest from Egypt is said to have made. 1. That the goddess Athena founded Athens 9,000 years ago, and Sais in Egypt 8,000 years ago, both before several great deluges that destroyed the earth. Yeah, the Greeks believed in more than one great flood. 2. Athens at that time was the best governed of all cities in the world, and was the leader of Greece. And for that reason, Athena gave many of its customs and laws to the Egyptians. 3. At that time, an island larger than the continents of Africa and Asia combined existed outside the Straits of Gibraltar called Atlantis. It was founded by the god Poseidon. 4. The first king of Atlantis was Atlas, the son of Poseidon. 5. Atlantis had an empire that controlled North Africa as far as Egypt and southern Europe as far as Italy. 6. Atlantis went to war with Athens and Egypt, but Athens defeated Atlantis, and it's been 9,000 years, at the time of Plato's writing, since this war. 7. Then, in a single day, due to violent earthquakes and floods, the army of Athens sank into the earth, and Atlantis sunk into the sea. 8. only a shoal of mud exists where the island of Atlantis used to be, making that part of the sea impassable by ships. The Critias has a full description of the layout of the city of Atlantis. None of this appears in the Timaeus. Both Bright and Alexander say that Solon made detailed notes of what he learned in Egypt. Alexander going so far as to say, Solon's detailed notes about the existence of this great empire were published 6 generations later by his descendant Plato, the great philosopher. His implication is that Solon gave his detailed notes to Plato. In other words, he's trying to give the impression that Plato was reproducing almost the exact wording of the hieroglyphs in the Temple of Neat. 2 sleights of hand they play here. First, nowhere in Plato's writing does it say that Solon took notes of what was in the temple, much less detailed notes. It does say he took a few notes down from the Egyptians and then began to work on a poem based on the tale that the priest told him. The reason Bright and Alexander say detailed notes, I guess, is because the description of Atlantis is so detailed in the Critias that they assume this description comes directly from Solon's writings. And yet, the character Critias, the one who is telling the Atlantis tale in this dialogue, is speaking off the cuff. He is not, in Plato's story, looking at any writings while he's speaking. He is going from memory. Moreover, Bright and Alexander emphasize that Plato was a descendant of Solon, and I guess are suggesting that since he was a relative, that means the notes must have been passed down from generation to generation. But according to the story, it is Critias, not Plato, who got the information from Solon. Note what Critias says. If Solon had only, like other poets, made poetry the business of his life, and had completed the tale which he brought with him from Egypt, and had not been compelled, by reason of the factions and troubles which he found stirring in his own country when he came home, to attend to other matters, in my opinion, he would have been as famous as Homer or Hesiod or any poet. So here Critias says that Solon was writing a poem about his experiences in Egypt, which he never finished. The suggestion also is that the purpose of the writing was not to present historical or scientific information, but to entertain. Critias explains why the characters in the Atlantis story have Greek names. I ought to warn you that you must not be surprised if you should perhaps hear Hellenic names given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason of this. Solon, who was intending to use the tale for his poem, inquired into the meaning of the names, and found that the early Egyptians, in writing them down, had translated them into their own language. And he recovered the meaning of the several names, and when copying them out again, translated them into our language. My great-grandfather Dropidas had the original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. So according to Critias, Solon copied down the pertinent names for his poem. But that's all he's said to have written down. Then he went home and started composing his poem. Critias's great-grandfather, Dropidas, who was a friend of Solon, had the unfinished poem, which he passed on to Critias. Please take note that Critias says that he studied the writing carefully when he was a child, which would have been many years ago. He does not say he studied it since, so whatever he's telling Socrates here is from memories formed long ago. There is nothing here about the information being passed to Plato. Keep in mind here that if this conversation between Critias and Socrates actually happened, then it would have happened many decades, at least 4, before Plato wrote it down. So he would have been remembering something Critias said about something Critias remembered studying as a child. Now, that is, of course, assuming that the conversation actually happened. But it is well known that Plato, especially in his later dialogues, simply made these conversations up. He invented them for the purpose of presenting his philosophical views. Here's what Bright Insight says about that.
According to the experts, Atlantis is just a fictional story that Plato made up to encourage better behavior among governments and its citizens. And modern academics are saying that the story of Atlantis must be false. Yet Plato and Solon were known for their brilliance of mind and strength of character. And this is the only example, at least that I'm aware of, where they were ever accused of lying about something. And the Egyptian description of Atlantis at the Temple of Neith in Sais, Egypt, no longer exists today, although perhaps those stones could be found underneath the Nile River somewhere, but it did exist for several hundred years, possibly a millennia. And I'm having difficulty finding an exact date on the temple's destruction by the Nile River, but it was long after Solon and Plato had died. So why would Solon and Plato lie about something that could be verified back then, as it was common for people to travel to Egypt, and the temple still existed at that time?
Let me ask you something. If you go to the movies, let's say you're watching a Marvel movie, do you think to yourself as you're watching the movie, hey, is the writer lying to me? Did this really happen? Of course not, because you know it's just a movie. Well, it's the same thing here. No one would have gone to verify Plato's words in Egypt, because they knew when they read the Timaeus and the Critias, they were reading fictional dialogues. Verification wouldn't even be on their minds. This is a major mistake that Alexander and Bright make, taking every word of these dialogues as the direct testimony of Plato to his audience, as if it were some kind of textbook. These are not Plato's lectures, nor Plato's historical works. They are Plato's dramas, in which characters in imaginative discussions spur readers to philosophical activity. Plato himself never speaks or even appears in any of his dialogues. Instead, Socrates does. But even though Socrates was a real person, it's unlikely that he engaged, historically speaking, in these actual conversations. Am I being too dismissive? I mean, couldn't these dialogues be transcripts of actual conversations that happened in real life? It seems highly improbable that Plato, as a youth, would have taken down a transcript of Socrates' conversations in some kind of shorthand, planning to write them into a book decades later. The idea of making transcripts of conversations is a modern concept anyway. Moreover, looking at Plato's dialogues as a whole, it would be amazing if Socrates had so many conversations with so many famous historical figures. It's more reasonable to conclude that the dialogues were a vehicle through which Plato could propound his own philosophical views, rather than simply a way for him to repeat things that Socrates taught. So that's how we know it's fiction. But that doesn't mean that each and every character is propounding Plato's views. Socrates quite often does propound Plato's views, although not all of the time, because he's a character too. The other characters, who sometimes are based on real people and sometimes completely invented, represent types, often authority figures, examples of those who might hold different lines of thought. Thoughts opposed to Plato or different from Plato. Okay, then, well, if Socrates is propounding Plato's views in the conversations, then we can say that Plato is speaking to us directly through Socrates, right? Usually. Though it's not a hard and fast rule, because Socrates often comes to the correct conclusion by the end, but at the beginning, he might not yet be there. But Socrates is not the character who gives the testimony about Atlantis. Another character, Critias, does. Who is Critias? It's possible that Plato's Critias character is modeled on the famous Critias, who was one of the 30 tyrants of Athens, a pro-Spartan oligarchy that came to power after the Peloponnesian War. But he's not explicitly identified as this Critias in Plato's works, and the age of the character doesn't really match up with the time. All we know from Plato's writing is that the character Critias says that his great-grandfather Dropidas was a friend of Solon. Was there a real Critias whose great-grandfather was Solon's friend? Maybe, but maybe not. Historical accuracy was not a priority in Plato's dialogues. All conversations in these works were constructed to facilitate the presentation of Plato's theories. Literary interpretation can go very wrong when one misunderstands the work's genre. Now, yeah, a writer from about 700 years later, Diogenes Laertius, claims that this Critias, in the book, was in real life Plato's great-uncle. Also that Solon's brother was Plato's ancestor. But Plato never says this. And scholars treat Diogenes' work with caution because Diogenes wrote so much later and never cites any sources. And even if Critias in real life was related to Plato, these dialogues are still not real life. So when anyone treats the words of the character Critias as historically factual, we rightly react with a healthy amount of skepticism. But you may ask, why would Plato make up the story of Atlantis and put it into Critias' mouth, especially in such detail? The answer is that Plato was using the myth of these ancient empires to make a point about the arrogance of empires in general, which could be related to political matters in his own time. The Timaeus opens with Socrates explicitly pegging the conversation as being about the state and the proper way of running it. It's evident from the corpus of Plato's works that Plato was both a myth teller and a myth maker. He often uses myth as a way of hooking his less philosophical readers so that they will be more interested in what he has to say. All over Plato's dialogues you'll find myths, whether that be traditional myths, which he sometimes modifies, or myths that he invents. The myths Plato uses are narratives that depict particular beings, deeds, places, or events that are purposely beyond the reader's experiences so that they cannot be rationally examined or empirically verified, even if his readers wanted to. So it fits in with what Plato always does. Despite the fact that Plato wouldn't want a reader to try to rationally verify his myths, that doesn't stop some today from trying it.
So one of the first things to point out is the supposed date of Atlantis' destruction according to what Solon had learned while visiting Egypt, which was that the event that destroyed the lost city had occurred 9,000 years earlier, which is a very interesting time frame, considering that Solon visited Egypt 2,600 years ago. And 9,000 years plus 2,600 years equates to 11,600 years before present time today, which just so happens to coincide with the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe, which of course I've discussed in many other videos. Long story short, to anyone that's not familiar or new to the channel, there was a massive change in global temperatures, sea levels fluctuated, a massive extinction event of 75% of mammals in North America occurred. There's even evidence of global fires said to have been larger than the ones that occurred during the extinction event that killed off the dinosaurs, scorching at least 10% of the Earth's land surface. The evidence for this event is scientifically overwhelming and is likely related to a fragmented comet. And the point is that it's very likely that this event is related in some way to the destruction of Atlantis.
Taking the character Critias' words as possibly factual, Bright Insight suggests that Atlantis may really have existed 9,000 years before Plato's time, so about 11,500 years before our present time. Even if we were to assume that Critias' tale is true, that Critias was a real person who had a granddad that knew Solon, and that Solon visited Egypt and got information about Atlantis from an Egyptian priest who wasn't lying about the hieroglyphics in the Temple of Neat, the earliest the writing in that temple could have existed was when Egypt had a full writing system. Our earliest example of a full sentence of Egyptian writing is from the reign of Set-Peribsen, around 2800 BCE. That's over 6,000 years after Bright says Atlantis was destroyed. 6,000 years! How can one explain how the information was preserved through all that time? Through a time without writing? Are we to believe that the detailed description we have of Atlantis in the Critias was preserved intact by humans orally through thousands of years of the Stone Age? That is a big frog to swallow. Bright Insight, in one of his other videos anyway, seems to realize this.
And the telephone game is a great analogy that shows how easily and quickly indirect communication can be corrupted, and it cannot be overstated how significant this is in regards to what we know about history, and how it's virtually impossible for truth to not be lost through time and translation.
Now, I know what Bright would say. He would say, well, some truth can be transmitted over that time. I mean, it might not be fully accurate, but the kernel of truth might still be there somewhere. Well, yeah, it could be. But the question is, what is your evidence for it? We don't have any evidence for the existence of the Atlantis myth prior to Plato, 2,400 years ago. And you're arguing that it existed long before then without evidence. It's just imagination. It's just saying, well, wouldn't it be cool? Well, yeah, it would be cool, but wishing it to be so doesn't make it true. Here we have a situation where the belief in the existence of the myth is preceding the evidence for it. The right way to do it is to base your belief on the existing evidence. Bright, notably, avoids mentioning that Critias also says that Athens existed 9,000 years before Plato's time. But this cannot be neatly ignored, since Critias' main point is that Athens and Atlantis were at war with one another 9,000 years previously. Do we have any evidence from archaeology of when Athens was founded? We do. Excavations on the Acropolis, the first part of the city to be inhabited, show that settlement goes back to Greek Neolithic times, about 3,500 to 3,200 BCE. That's 6,000 years too late for Critias' tale to be true. If we can't trust what he says about the age of Athens, we can't trust what he says about the age of Atlantis, since he ties the history of the two together. No one mentions that a description of 9,000-year-old Athens is provided by Critias in just as much detail as the description of Atlantis. And this description of Athens contains all sorts of fantasies that contradict archaeological evidence of the site. As for the Younger Dryas comet impact hypothesis, the published science on that claims that this occurred 12,800 years ago, which is 1,200 years removed from Plato's timing. If you're interested in learning more about the impact hypothesis, I've done a separate video on that, which you can check out at your leisure. Now, the argument that Bright Insight, based on Alexander, uses to suggest that the Richat structure was the site of Atlantis is not what you might think is the obvious one, that the remains of a magnificent ancient city have been found there. Alas, no. The site is completely empty of ruins. Instead, their argument relies on matching the characteristics of the site with the description written in the Critias.
Because in this video, I'm going to use the exact words that Plato used to describe Atlantis, its location, and the geographical land features that surround it.
In order to make the case as strong as possible, Bright Insight chooses only the parts of the description of Atlantis in the Critias that would best make the case, and he leaves out the rest. The parts he uses are as follows. That the diameter of the structure matches the diameter that's given by Critias. That Critias says that Atlantis was on a level plane, and the Richat structure's on a level plane. That Critias says that there are mountains to the north of Atlantis, and there are mountains to the north of the Richat structure. That there was a river in the area, and Plato says Atlantis had rivers. And that the colored rocks near the Richat structure match the colored rocks given in Critias' description. Kinda. That Critias says that there was both a hot spring and a cold spring at the site, and the Richat is a hydrothermal complex. That Critias says there were elephants near Atlantis, and that there are elephants within the vicinity of the Richat structure, and that Critias says there was copper and gold in Atlantis, and there is copper and gold and iron in Mauritania. As you probably can see, most of these are quite general and could fit the description of probably hundreds of sites. They're simply not specific enough. Yes, the Richat is a hydrothermal complex, but it is the coexistence of the two opposite springs that makes it unique, and his evidence of a cold spring within the structure is lacking. All he can do is point out the remains of an undated well, which is not the same as a spring. But the first one I want to comment on, because it is specific and appears to match. At first thought, this piece of evidence seems impressive. Wow, the size of the site today is exactly the same as in Plato's Critias. But the number is fudged. First of all, this is not an exact fit, it's an approximate fit. It's ballpark. Critias says that Atlantis was 127 stadia in diameter. That's the Greek measurement. Well, how long is a stadion? Well, that's tricky. The ancient Greeks did not have a precise length for it. A stadion was an approximate measurement, ranging from about 607 to about 630 feet, or 185 to 192 meters. So Alexander chose a length for a stadion that would most closely match the size of the Richat structure, so then it could look like an almost perfect match. Second, the site's diameter doesn't measure 23 kilometers. It measures 38 kilometers. In order to make the measurement fit, Alexander had to eliminate the outer trench and the ridge beyond that. So he's basically taking out the parts of the Richat structure that prove inconvenient. Now, to be sure that I am steel-manning Corsetti here, maybe he isn't using these features as a way to demonstrate that the Richat is the location of Atlantis, but rather only that it could be the location of Atlantis. In this case, he wouldn't need to show that it is the only place that fits the description, but only that it is a place that fits the description. Okay, well then, if that is the argument being made, then features given by Critias that do not match the Richat would rule it out as a possibility, right? Here are the parts given by Critias that do not match the structure. The island of Atlantis was larger than Africa and Asia combined. The Greeks called Africa Libya, the whole continent, Libya. It now was a barrier of mud through which Greek ships could no longer get from Greece to the ocean. There was an abundance of wood in the area, including fruit trees and chestnuts. A canal was dug from the outer circle to the inner one. The outer land zone had a width of 3 stadia, and so did the next land zone inside of it. The next 2 land zones inside each had a width of 2 stadia, and the next land zone inside of that had a width of 1 stadion. The center island had a diameter of 5 stadia. A wall 50 stadia distant from the outermost land zone was built around the city, which means the city limits would have extended well beyond the outer trench of the Richat structure. And mountains completely surrounded the plain on which the city sat. And the plain was 3,000 stadia in length and 2,000 stadia in width. None of these descriptions, none of them, match up with the Richat structure. Corsetti also responds to some common objections to his proposal. Let's see how he answers them. In his later videos, Corsetti addresses the objection that the measurements of the Richat don't match those given by Critias in Plato.
We must consider the significance of that this is a 12,000-year-old story, and that lost in translation is a very real thing. In fact, I would argue that there is a 0% chance that every single part of what Plato wrote could be 100% accurate. In fact, Plato specifically told us that in the Critias. Quote, "I have described the city and the environs of the ancient palace nearly, so not perfectly, in the words of Solon," and here's the big part, "and now I must endeavor to represent to you the nature and arrangement of the rest of the land." That's straight from the Critias itself, which, by the way, is an uncompleted book that just cuts off in the middle and the rest is missing. So that's a mystery in itself, but we don't even have the entire dialogue of what he said about Atlantis.
Probably because it was never finished. But yes, so far I think all reasonable people can agree Critias' tale is said to be related by memory and therefore would not be 100% accurate, even in the context of the story.
But here, Plato is literally telling you that he either can't read, translate, or decipher various parts of Solon's notes. Yet, some people have chosen to take his words completely at face value.
As a reminder, Plato isn't saying it, Critias is. Plato never claims to have had Solon's notes.
Let's not forget, guys, that Solon lived 200 years before Plato. Think about how many words have changed in your own language within the last couple hundred years. I mean, heck, if I go and read notes from the founding fathers of the United States in the 1700s and 1800s, go read that stuff and look at how many words have changed you don't understand, or they say things that are just totally different than today. So again, considering this is a 12,000-year-old story, passed through numerous languages, or at least a few languages over that period of time, lost in translation is just a real thing.
Remember that he's bringing this up to address the issue of the measurements. The argument being made here is that we cannot be sure that the measurements are accurate. I think this point can be granted. But then, how can we argue that the other details are accurate? The ones that were used to support the Richat hypothesis, such as the description of the geography and flora and fauna and resources and the colors of the rocks. I find it ironic that on one hand, Corsetti argues vigorously for the truthfulness of the Atlantis story, but on the other hand argues that it is not entirely accurate. So I have to ask, how does one tell which parts of the story are accurate and which parts are not? If he can assert that the parts about the measurements are wrong, or that the parts about the war with Athens are wrong, or the chestnuts, someone else equally can assert that the parts about the colored rocks or the elephants are wrong, and argue for a different location for Atlantis. You see, if we were to approach this scientifically, wanting to show that the Richat hypothesis has strength, but also knowing that the story might have errors, we would make a full list of all the characteristics of the city of Atlantis in the story, and then test the Richat hypothesis up against them one by one. Then we would see how many match. If we had, say, 80% matches or more, we would know it is a decent hypothesis. Hey, even 65% or more. But if we simply wave away the ones that don't match and only highlight the ones that do match, we're just forcing the fit.
But to make one last point on this, to nail the coffin on the point that I'm making here, is that consider that according to the Math Association of America, scholars disagree greatly on the length of the ancient Greek measurement of the stade, and go on to say that there are at least 6 different variations of the ancient Greek stade measurement. Again, this is what lost in translation looks like. We can't even conclude measurements details of 4,000 years ago, so why on earth would people assume that a 12,000-year-old story that's been passed through multiple languages would be totally correct? All of this is even more reason to not bother debating the described measurements of Atlantis.
Yes, the exact measurement of the stade varies, but it doesn't vary that much. It has an approximate measurement, and even the approximate measurement doesn't work for the Richat.
I'm quite amazed that people have used this as an argument against the Richat, as they completely ignore the scientific fact that the bedrock that makes up the Richat itself was stripped by cataclysmic flooding. Consider that the hills, which make up the rings of the Richat, would be thinner at the top, as it's like a hill, and we all know how hills work, and it's wider at the bottom. But now that we've heard and know that the flooding has stripped the bedrock off the top, that throws off the measurements from when it was covered with water. It would have been wider at the bottom, but that's not the part they'd be measuring. They'd be measuring the point of that's above the water. Do you see what I'm saying? Listen to this clip by Randall Carlson that explains the point I'm trying to make here involving the bedrock being stripped away.
To me, then, what that suggests is that you had this fluvial event or events that stripped away the overlying layers of rock to expose this core of this thing, which is, again, if you picture that it domes up, the dome essentially, picture a large pimple, right? And then if you shear the top of it off, what's going to happen is you're going to see a ringed structure. Does that make sense?
Now, he was not describing that in regards to the measurements of Atlantis, but it's a crucial point in explaining that the measurements would have to be off, knowing that the bedrock was obliterated away. So for the several reasons I just mentioned above, I do not think that the size of Atlantis is something that can be accurately or even appropriately debated.
So now the argument is that the measurements of the Richat could have matched Atlantis at one time, but that natural forces have altered the original measurements. Okay, setting aside the fact that he used an argument from authority here, and his authority is Randall Carlson, who is not a professional geologist. He calls himself a geomythicist, I believe. What Corsetti is doing here is making it so that any measurements brought to bear on this question cannot falsify his thesis. All right, sure, but if the measurements cannot falsify his thesis, that also means the measurements can't substantiate it, as he tried to do earlier with the diameter. We thus have one less support for a match between Plato and the Richat, and the one about the diameter was the only one that could really pinpoint the location. On his FAQ page on his website, George Alexander answers the objection about the measurements not matching up by saying this: the information which we have about those inner dimensions is from the Egyptian colony, from a country dominated by the Atlantean military forces. Any superpower, today or then, will keep information about military capabilities, size, and strength confidential or misleading. One could almost expect that. So, any description that doesn't match, we can just dismiss as deliberate Atlantean misinformation. But any description that matches, we can be impressed by and marvel at. That's some more creative accounting right there. Another objection to the theory that Corsetti tries to answer is, why is the Richat structure so far from the sea? As you can see from any map, the Richat structure is hundreds of miles from the shore. Corsetti responds to this by saying that Plato says Atlantis is now landlocked, so it's to be expected.
Consider Plato's exact words in regards to the aftermath of the cataclysm. Quote, "Atlantis is part of the Atlantic which is no longer accessible by ship. Atlantis, when sunk by the earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. In other words, it became landlocked." Again, if this is the site of Atlantis, and if the details shared by Solon and Plato are true, and if the Richat structure was the site of Atlantis, then it's not hard to see that perhaps a lot of sand or mud was pushed into Africa from the ocean during some sort of catastrophic event.
However, the document doesn't really say that Atlantis is landlocked. Critias says that it is a mud barrier that prevents ships from getting from Greece to the Atlantic Ocean. That's not the same as landlocked.
And so now here is one huge detail that is either unknown or not shared by researchers, which is that the ancient Greek word that was used by Plato to describe island was the word nessos. Well, you might be quite surprised to know that the word nessos actually had 5 meanings to the ancient Greeks, including the words island, promontory, peninsula, coast, and even land within a continent that is surrounded by lakes, rivers, or streams. My goodness, that certainly qualifies the Richat structure. People in modern times allow themselves to get caught up by the word island without thoroughly researching the history of its translation.
The word Nessos means land that is surrounded by water, often all the way around, but not necessarily. An island, of course, is surrounded on all sides, and a peninsula or promontory on 3 sides. But that doesn't match the Richat, at least not currently. And I haven't been able to find a time period in which it did match. And remember, the island of Atlantis is described as being as big as Africa and Asia combined, which suggests that it isn't in Africa.
Another profound detail why we should not be looking for Atlantis at the bottom of the ocean is because when you specifically read what Plato actually wrote in describing Atlantis' final resting place, he states, quote, "And the island of Atlantis was similarly swallowed up by the sea and vanished. This is why the sea in that area is to this day impassable to navigation, which is hindered by mud just below the surface, the remains of the sunken island." That in no way describes an island that sank to the bottom of the ocean.
But it does put it underwater, even if it's not very deep.
Furthermore, if you go to the Temple of Horus in Edfu, Egypt today, the ancients carved in stone that they had came from the primeval ones, who were survivors of an island that was destroyed in a cataclysm, and they specifically stated that all that was left of that land were the reeds, which is grass, that was still penetrating through the water where it had been submerged, meaning that it was at such shallow depths that the grass could still be seen. Even Graham Hancock has discussed this in detail in lectures as well as in his book, Magician of the Gods, which I highly recommend. But the point is that the destroyed capital is not at the bottom of the ocean, and it was never said to be.
The Temple of Horus in Edfu, despite what Graham Hancock says, never mentions Atlantis or relates any story that resembles the Atlantis tale. In fact, in order to make it sound like Atlantis, Hancock had to take bits of words from here and there and assemble them in order to create his own version. And these bits and pieces come from a creation story. They're from before the founding of the world in Egyptian cosmology. But I realize that Jimmy's point is that Atlantis need not be deep in the ocean. I don't think we need to take issue with that.
But an impassable barrier of mud would be exactly what we could see within the hundreds of miles of dirt found between the Richat and the Atlantic Ocean.
Wait a minute, what? This is the impassable barrier of mud, which you just said was under the surface of the water? When Critias refers to an impassable barrier of mud, he's talking about something that exists in his own time. This is why the sea in that area is, to this day, impassable to navigation, which is hindered by mud just below the surface, the remains of the sunken island. Critias knows about Africa. He refers to it. Africa in his time was pretty much like the Africa of today. There's no possible way that this could be the mud below the surface of the ocean that he's talking about. Bright also makes the astounding claim that previous to Atlantis' destruction, 12,000 years ago, most of West Africa was submerged.
But some will say that the Richat could not have increased to its current elevation of nearly 1,300 feet in just 12,000 years. So we must evaluate empirical scientific data to understand what could be geologically possible over the course of some 12,000 years. Let's consider the example of Antarctica that I used in my prior video and the fact that the continent is rising at a rate of 1.6 inches per year as a result of subsurface activity. 1.6 inches a year. Well, do the math on the Richat's elevation, and you will see that even if it was uplifted at a slower rate than Antarctica, it is well within the possibility over this length of time. And here you can see just a few different examples of several outstanding comments I received from viewers who pointed this out and shared their own calculations. Now, using those calculations, take a look at what the area would look like when you account for the difference in elevation and sea level. These images you are seeing are from floodmap.net. Go there and play with the numbers and tell me that this isn't incredibly interesting.
Did you notice that Bright makes a correlation between the rising of Antarctica and the proposed rising of Africa without consideration for the reason why Antarctica is rising and how long it has been rising? He's very much interested in the part of the article's title that says Antarctica is getting taller, but not interested at all in the here's why part. I mean, if you want to show that Africa has risen by using these findings about Antarctica, you'd want to demonstrate that whatever phenomenon is making Antarctica rise exists in Africa. You can't just say, well, this is a continent, and so is that. Whatever happens to one continent can happen to any continent. That simply isn't true. In the very second paragraph of the article, it is said quite clearly that the reason Antarctica is rising is because as ice melts, its weight on the rock below lightens, and over time, when enormous quantities of ice have disappeared, the bedrock rises in response, pushed up by the flow of the viscous mantle below Earth's surface. Is this happening in Africa? No. No ice. And the phenomenon is happening in Antarctica because of the increase in temperature caused by climate change. This is a recent phenomenon, yet Bright wants us to believe that it has been happening to Africa for 12,000 years. When people were making calculations about how far Africa would have to rise, did they take into consideration that the water level during the Younger Dryas was 70 meters lower than it is today?
Now, some will look at these flood maps and say, well, yeah, you're just playing with numbers here to make the scenario work, but we're really not, because the known scientific evidence is that the Richat structure was uplifted by subsurface magma chambers, thus increasing the surrounding elevation.
Now he gives a completely different reason for the rising of Africa than the rising of Antarctica. Go figure. But you know what? Talking about how the Richat structure was made does not explain how the entirety of West Africa rose.
And not to mention, there is additional evidence of widespread subsurface volcanic activity in the region, as we can see in the examples of the nearby Canary and Cape Verde Islands, which are just off the coast of West Africa. So clearly, the subsurface activity is widespread and has been ongoing for a considerable length of time.
I can't tell if Bright thinks this constitutes proof that all of West Africa rose from the sea, or if he's just pointing out the possibility. But all of that is really irrelevant. We already know what the coastline of Africa looked like 11,000 years ago. Not much different than it is today. Not being a geologist, well, even if he were a geologist, he would need to provide scientific evidence that such a thing actually happened. As far as I know, there is no single geological study that has ever concluded such a thing about this part of Africa. But there are hundreds that contradict it.
It's funny how people will claim that the Richat could not have been at sea level, yet they never mention the existing salt all around the area, including within the Richat. But when we consider that the whole region is known for its volcanic activity, including the various island chains off the west coast of Africa and the massive Atlas mountain chain located north of the Richat, and the very fact that the Richat structure itself is considered to be the result of repeated volcanic activity, as it was said to have been lifted and collapsed multiple times over, thus creating the ring structure we see today. It's more than appropriate to assume that the surrounding area has subsequently been lifted as well, because that's exactly what volcanic activity does. It lifts the ground in the surrounding area.
I don't think Corsetti is claiming that the same volcanic activity that created the Richat also lifted the continent, because it's the wrong time period. He seems to be saying that this area has a history of volcanic activity, so why couldn't volcanoes have lifted Mauritania? And the answer to that is, if there was evidence for that, it would be staring us in the face, and geologists would have seen it and published on it. If he wants to make a case that volcanoes lifted Mauritania, he needs to present the scientific evidence for it. FYI, the Atlas Mountains were created by the collision of the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, not by volcanoes.
And most people understand this, but to paint you a picture of what's possible, let's just consider the extraordinary case of the Paracutan volcano in Mexico. On February 20th, 1943, a volcano suddenly started to develop on a farmer's field, and the cone rose to nearly 1,500 feet or 450 meters from its base in the very first year. So the fact that the Richat is less than 1,300 feet above sea level is completely feasible to have been lifted over the course of some 12,000 years, even when we consider the lower global sea levels at that time.
Rather, a lot of speculation is happening here. And even if he is merely arguing that it is possible or plausible, we still need to see some actual science from the area that will convince us of this. How many volcanoes would you need to lift this whole region? Seems to me like it would be a lot. So where are they all? Moreover, they all would need to have erupted between 11,500 years ago and 4,000 years ago, our earliest evidence of Neolithic settlement in the area.
It is worth discussing the geological phenomenon known as isostatic response, or glacial isostatic adjustment, which describes that when ice melts, the significant reduction in weight causes the land to lift back up, but subsequently causes land in other areas to decrease, which is the likely explanation for the sunken Azore Islands, as it's been suggested that the melted North American ice shelf caused that land to lift and subsequently caused the land in the Atlantic Ocean to sink. But if that is indeed the case, would that not potentially have caused North Africa to lift? I don't know.
I can help out there. For the land to rise through glacial isostatic adjustment, there needs to have been a huge and heavy layer of ice on top of it. There wasn't a glacier on top of Mauritania, so we can't use this phenomenon to argue that Africa rose when the ice melted. As for the areas on the periphery of a glacier, these would have risen when the ice formed and sunk when the ice melted. And that is what happened with the Azores. Jimmy suggests a possible additional opposite effect on the periphery of the periphery, but measurements have already been taken and show that this has not occurred.
But another enthralling detail that goes along these lines is to note that the antipode of the Richat structure today, and by the way, if you're not familiar, an antipode is a location that is directly opposite of another location on our globe. So get this, the antipode of Mauritania is Zealandia, a scientifically confirmed sunken continent that was only discovered in 2017. And considering that many have theorized that what happens on one side of the Earth could potentially affect the location directly on the other side, this detail is worthy of discussion. And by the way, let me give a quick shout out to my great friend Nikki of the Nikkiana Jones YouTube podcast channel for sharing this highly thought-provoking detail with me.
Zealandia was completely submerged by 23 million years ago. This is just one of those cases where someone notices an interesting coincidence, along the same lines as, hey, did you ever notice that dog spelled backwards is God? According to the published science, The Richat structure is between 100 million and 66 million years old. I learned that the Sahara Desert began forming 7 million years ago, when the tectonic plates of Africa and Eurasia collided and the Tethys Sea started shrinking. The region around the Eye of the Sahara was arid during the last glacial maximum between 22,000 and 14,500 years ago. The desert was actually bigger than it is today. Then we enter what is called the African humid period, between 14,500 and 5,500 years ago, when a wobble of the Earth on its axis created wetter conditions for a few thousand years. This caused the Sahara to retreat to a certain extent, and yes, for part of that time, Mauritania was a grassland. I'll leave links to this information below the video for you to check. In the middle of the African humid period was the Younger Dryas period, lasting from 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, when the Earth was cooling. Then in the second two-thirds of the African humid period, the Earth was warming up. Now, where does the Richat hypothesis fit into all this? Corsetti is placing Atlantis in the first part of the African humid period. At this time, sea levels were low, and the Richat structure was even further away from the ocean than it is now. Yet Corsetti argues that Mauritania basically was just below the water's surface at that time. He says Atlantis was destroyed at the end of the Younger Dryas in some kind of flood. At the end of the Younger Dryas, the sea level was still lower than the sea level today. After that, it began to rise with meltwater pulse 1b, but the science says it rose slowly over centuries, if not millennia. Geological history is just not matching up with what he's proposing.
And not only that, doesn't the entire region look like it was blasted by flowing water or a tsunami? You can see the striations in the land going from west to east from the ocean. Tell me that this doesn't look like a massive wave or a steady flow of water completely altered the terrain.
Remember that he believes this land was underwater prior to the tsunami. So he's saying that the wave altered the terrain underwater. How does that happen exactly? Is there a known scientific process that does this? What kind of marks are left on the seafloor when a tsunami passes over? He says it gets blasted. I guess it makes these lines. Is he getting this from science or just his imagination? Let's look at how far these striations go. Yeah. All the way over here. Does it look to you like a tsunami could reach this far? Look, it takes us right to where riverbeds can be seen. Water definitely flowed through here all right, but the reasonable conclusion is that it flowed north to southwest, not the other way around, and that the erosion of these channels took place over an extended period of time. And you might say, well, after the tsunami, it would have drained out that way. Well, that's when the tsunami was weak, not strong.
And something else we should consider is that the sands of the Sahara actually originate from the sea, an interesting fact that many people are not aware of.
This is not a fact, and in fact is a falsehood. The sand of the Sahara is just weathered rock. Closer to the shore, yeah, you're going to get some deposits that have washed up onto the beach. It's possible that some beach sand gets blown into the desert, yeah. These particles can often come from long distances because the wind blows them, sometimes from several hundred miles away. But most of it from the Sahara is from the Cretaceous limestone that existed there long ago and which has experienced wind erosion for millions of years. George S. Alexander, in the Visiting Atlantis video, says that it's weird that erosion would occur in a dry place. He says, "One thing is clear, the place has been severely eroded and washed out. Interesting for one of the driest places on Earth." I'm glad Bright at least didn't repeat this, because the comment shows that Alexander has never even heard of wind erosion, which is common in the desert. I'm no geologist, and even I know that. This information is widely available, so it certainly seems deceptive for Alexander to use it as evidence that there was an ocean in Mauritania 11,000 years ago. The seashells in the desert are from millions of years ago as well. You see the danger in taking things out of context?
Let me also mention that there is evidence that this region was under the ocean far more recently than the tens of millions of years that some people claim, as non-fossilized whale bones have been found in the desert of Mauritania. And this example you're seeing here should not be confused with a different discovery in the Egyptian desert of actual fossils of whale bones. And you can clearly see the difference for yourself, as fossils are essentially bones that over millions of years became stone. So, if scientists claim that it takes more than 1 million years for bones to become fossils, why are there non-fossilized whale bones in the desert of Mauritania?
You want to see exactly where these whale bones were discovered? Where this picture was taken? I'll show you. Right here. Yeah. Right on the coast, right next to the ocean. You know, where whales live. This whale washed up on the beach. They were not found deep in the desert of Mauritania, as Bright suggests. George S. Alexander adds to this and says, "In exploring the Eye of Africa, we were shown ancient fishing equipment, as well as stone rings that were used thousands of years ago. They resembled the same shape and design we'd seen the fishermen at the coast use to bind and weigh down their nets. It was explained to us how these and other artifacts were once used for fishing. This was further evidence to us that what is now 400 kilometers inland may have once been a place by the sea." During the African humid period, there were lakes in the area, and yes, fishing took place in them. So there's nothing unusual in finding fishing implements in the area. Now, since the tools Alexander refers to are unprovenanced, it's difficult to determine their age. But one thing is certainly true. These fishing tools are not exclusive to ocean fishing.
Anyone who's ever visited a sandy ocean beach has certainly noticed the ripples of sand created by the flow of water, which later become exposed with the coming and going of the tide. These landmark current ripples are of course quite small, measuring in merely inches. And although they are not something that we would typically pay much attention to, they are nonetheless the result and obvious evidence that the ocean had once flowed over the area.
Or water. Scientists have studied ripple marks for a long time, and even have done experiments to reproduce such an effect. They even do it in school science classes and science fairs. Ripple marks, like you see on the beach, are created by the ebb and flow of tides. One wave will not be able to create this effect. You need a back and forth motion. After one ripple is created, ripples form on either side of it, then ripples on either sides of those ones, and so forth. It's a process, not an event.
However, what I'm about to share with you is so astonishing that by the end of this video, you will never think of these ripples of sand or the entire Sahara Desert in the same way ever again. You see, if a typical tidal current that is just a few feet or meters in depth can create sand ripples that are measured in merely inches, then what on earth would it take to create ripples that are, get this, more than a mile apart and literally hundreds of feet tall? That's right, so large in fact that they can only be truly appreciated from far above with the use of satellite imagery. What you're seeing here is more than 200 miles inland off the Atlantic coast of Mauritania in the western Sahara Desert of Africa. Smack dab in the middle of a remote region of the Sahara that has inexplicably massive amounts of water erosion that is so extreme that the striations can clearly be seen from space. And upon a closer look, you can see the same landmark current ripples that we observe on most any beach. However, instead of being measured in mere inches or feet, these ripples are so extraordinarily enormous that they are measurable in miles. That's right, in fact, the smallest of these ripples are closer to 3/4 of a mile apart, with many right in the neighborhood of a mile, with some of the largest measuring 6,300 feet apart, which equates to 1¼ mile. And just a quick reminder that 1 mile equates to 5,280 feet, or some 1,600 meters.
Knowing that sand ripples are caused by the ebb and flow of water, such as a tide, and not by a single wave, what are we to conclude about giant ripples that are supposedly made by the same process? That there was a giant tide that went back and forth over this land? In 300 miles and out 300 miles every day? But we could have ripples made by the flow of water current over time. Do you know what else creates ripple marks besides water? Wind. That's right. This is another process geologists have known about for a long time, and it's very common in the desert. You can see examples of ripple marks from wind in the desert in many places. Sand dunes can range in height from a few centimeters to over 1,250 feet. Deserts are where you can find the tallest sand dunes in the world. Duna Frederico Quirbas in Argentina is the highest. It's 4,035 feet tall. And that wind has been blowing around the Sahara for millennia. Any supposed sand ripples created by water would have been erased long ago.
Now, real quick, to put this into perspective, let me show you a short video clip that went viral a few years ago when Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock appeared on the Joe Rogan Experience podcast and shared the enormous current ripples in the middle of Montana that were created by the catastrophic flooding that occurred during the rapid melting of the North American ice shelf at the end of the last ice age. Just listen to what they have to say here.
Rippled landscape that looks exactly like the beach looks.
Yeah, keep coming around with
That's
that.
the thing, it's fractal, because this is the whole mystery of this, that this happens at a scale of inches on beaches and a scale of hundreds of feet here.
And there's a farmhouse. You see the farmhouse there? Now those ripples are, the tallest ones are about the height of a 5-story building.
Whoa, like 70 feet or something like
50
that?
feet.
50 feet?
50
Okay.
feet.
So those are 50 feet high.
Okay, let's pause again.
Whoa.
Look at this.
This is crazy.
This is totally crazy. This is one of the craziest things you'll ever see.
These ripples, the repeated ripples in an area where there's nothing else like it.
The closest we can get to it is a tsunami. But even there, you got to picture the tsunamis that we've experienced in the last decade and a half in Indonesia and Japan. When they made landfall, those tsunamis were roughly between 20 and 50 feet, depending on where you were relative to the oncoming wave and how far distant you were from it. Here, what you have to visualize is a tsunami sweeping over the land that's over 1,000 feet deep. That's what happened here. And we know that because we can trace the high water marks on the hillsides are clearly left. The high water marks are clearly etched into the hillsides.
Pretty mind-blowing, right? So now the question becomes that if landmark current ripples that are 50 feet tall and just shy of 300 feet apart as I measured on Google Earth, and were created by a flow of water that was 1,000 feet deep, then what on earth happened to create ripples that are 200 feet tall and again exceeding more than a mile apart?
Yes, Randall Carlson described the late Pleistocene Missoula megaflood gravel dunes of Camas Prairie, Montana, as ripples produced by a tsunami action in massive floodwaters released from the Cordilleran ice sheet. These Camas Prairie ripples are composed of gravel and boulders, not sand. Geologists specializing in the Ice Age floods of North America say that the Camas Prairie ripples were formed by strong currents associated with somewhere between 40 and 100 emptyings of glacial Lake Missoula, and that this happened between 17,000 and 13,000 years ago. And although it was not a tsunami that created these, geologists have compared the ripples to ripples created by flowing rivers, and that these currents must have been a lot larger and stronger. The important point here for our purposes is that these marks were made by strong flows that occurred over many years, and not a single event.
But if that isn't incredible enough, this is where things become spectacularly strange, as I'm about to share with you 3 pieces of evidence that are so unbelievably compelling that they corroborate that this water erosion occurred in just the last 11 to 12,000 years. Now, real quick, before I show you that, let's first be clear. These are not sand dunes. They are indeed ripples created by forces of flowing water, just like we see at the beach. For example, let's take a look at what actual confirmed sand dunes look like in comparison. And there is perhaps no better example than the sand dunes of Namibia, which rank among the largest dunes found anywhere on Earth, and are conveniently geographically located right at the coastline of the Atlantic Ocean, which provides us a fantastically ideal comparison as we're able to observe sand dunes and ocean current ripples at the same location. And although these massive sand dunes can give a similar appearance to the landmark current ripples, upon a closer inspection you can certainly distinguish the difference in that they are made entirely of sand. Whereas in the Sahara, you have the visible marks of water-eroded bedrock that have taken the shape of current ripples in the same way that we see at the beach.
These formations do indeed appear to be more than just sand dunes, but it's weird how he was just showing us sand as an example of how water makes ripple marks, and used that to establish how the giant ripple marks in Mauritania were made, but now he's saying the Mauritania ripple marks are not sand. Well, then there's no comparison. It's not the same effect. What Corsetti is pointing at here is from the effect of erosion, an entirely different process than what you see at the beach.
These massive current ripples have been confirmed by subject matter experts such as Randall Carlson.
I think one of the factors that is leading Corsetti astray is his reliance on Randall Carlson as a subject expert, when he is in fact not a subject expert. There's nothing wrong with being a self-taught amateur, as Carlson is, but there's always the chance that your knowledge is incomplete, which is the case here. And when you present yourself as an authority, or at least others consider you an authority, you're going to lead them into the same errors that you have fallen into. If Corsetti were to have conversations with actual geologists who specialize in this area, then he would be getting very different answers.
And you know, I can't help being reminded of what I noticed not long ago while taking a walk along an irrigation canal not far from where I live. You can see the same water-induced current ripples of sand at the bottom that were created by the canal's flowing water. Those are not sand dunes. So when we consider that the Sahara is clearly covered in vast measures of water erosion, the next question becomes, how and when did this happen?
Oh, so now he is calling it erosion. Does he think what happened in his irrigation canal is erosion? Surely not. But now to his question of how and when it happened. I think I can help with that. The area to the southwest of the Richat where he's showing us these formations is called the Adrar. Geological studies, and there are many done in this country, mostly in French, have shown that these marks are watercourse terraces. You can see here where rivers used to run down. There are the remains of two big ones that cut through. As the river cuts through different layers of sediments, it exposes the underlying geology, leading to the creation of valleys and gorges. This process takes place over thousands of years. Many of the slopes, by the way, are made of red sands with black varnished gravel on top. In these valleys were found Acheulean workshop sites, which means that the valleys were already there in the lower Paleolithic period, long before Corsetti's proposed tsunami. He is right that these formations were made by water, but they aren't the same process that makes sand ripples on the beach, and they certainly were not created by a single catastrophic event.
Let's first look at the strange abundance of salt located throughout the Sahara Desert, which I have discussed previously. Many people are not aware that the Sahara provides vast amounts of salt trade throughout the region. This is something that is widely documented, and I have argued that the fact that this salt sits on top of the current ripples is suggestive evidence that the ocean had flowed over the region and the existing salt is the remnants of evaporated seawater that had settled here. For example, high concentrations of salt are found in the region surrounding Mauritania specifically, such as the Sekva salt mine in the capital of Nouakchott, located right at the coast, and can be seen as white blemishes from satellite imagery. All of that is salt. And I have of course shared the nature of salt found within the Richat structure, and the areas with the most of it are all at the lowest elevations, thus suggesting that seawater had settled and eventually evaporated here. Another great example of this can be found as far away as the eastern Sahara, where we have a nearly 100-mile wide patch of surface salt. You can take it upon yourself to go to Google Earth and can view the changes of elevation with your computer's mouse cursor and see firsthand that this salt patch sits on a depression and is at a lower elevation by a few hundred feet than the entire surrounding area. And when you take into account that this is in the midst of a clear path of massive water erosion, as you can see in the striations, it becomes obvious that seawater had indeed settled here.
Where did the salt flats of Mauritania come from? Researching geology papers on the subject has revealed some super interesting facts that I want to share with you. The idea that the salt is residue from a time when the ocean was here seems reasonable because, after all, there are two kinds of water, salt water and fresh water is not going to leave salt. So, it must have been salt water, which is what the ocean has. But did you know that salt water can also come from salt lakes? Yes, and this region was full of them. Lakes can be salty through processes similar to those that made the ocean salty. Erosion of minerals caused by rains run into the water, but when the water evaporates, it doesn't take the salt with it. The salt stays, and over time, through a cycle of evaporation and then rain to refill, the salt accumulates in the water. It took millions of years for the ocean to get salty, but lakes are much smaller, so the process happens much more quickly. Here in Mauritania, salt and gypsum, which is underground, can also seep into the water from below. As the Sahara has become more arid in the last 5,500 years, the salt lakes have completely evaporated, leaving the salt behind. There once was a salt lake at the Richat. This was studied in depth by geologist Philippe Chamard, who found that the salt overlies about 10 meters of green clays, with remains indicative of a supersaline lagoon environment. Pollen analysis revealed the existence of marshy prairie vegetation. 2 shorelines have been detected, one higher and one lower. The lower one has Neolithic remains associated with it. This means that the salt is younger than the Neolithic remains. Organic deposits from the lake have been carbon dated. 7 samples were taken, and the dates ranged from 9,230 to 7,320 years BP, before present, which means the lake was there during the African humid period, but well after the Younger Dryas. The salt, therefore, not only is from a lake, but also the lake post-dates the time Corsetti places the destruction of Atlantis. And the salt flat was formed after the lake evaporated, which was when the Sahara became arid again.
So hold that thought, as the next 2 pieces of evidence that I'm going to share are a total game changer in substantiating that this flooding erosion happened within the last 11 to 12,000 years. Because here's the thing. Many will dismiss all this water erosion as being related to what's referred to as the Trans-Saharan Seaway, which was said to exist approximately 56 to 66 million years ago. In fact, most scientific estimates lazily estimate that this was likely between 50 and 100 million years ago, which, let's be real, is a ridiculously large ballpark range of an estimate. But upon further investigation, you will notice that nowhere in these studies of the Trans-Saharan Seaway does it annotate that it had flowed over the Western Sahara Desert. It simply shows that it went south. However, anyone can jump on Google Earth and clearly observe that there is confirmed water erosion over the exact areas annotated for this seaway.
From what I have studied, geologists do not date all the erosion marks on the land here all the way back to 50 or 100 million years ago. The Sahara was green in many periods of time, so the marks do not need to be made during the time of the Trans-Saharan Seaway. There are millions of years of Saharan history during which this could have happened. It's not an either-or situation.
But here's the thing. The same water erosion clearly goes west out to the Atlantic Ocean, as you've already noticed, which, bizarrely, these recent studies do not annotate whatsoever. Which is why I argue that something else happened far more recently than the Saharan Seaway of some 60 million years ago. And this is the part where things get extraordinarily interesting, because the highest point in the Sahara Desert is a volcano located in Chad called Koussi, which reaches a height of 11,300 feet at its caldera, and is said to have been created during an eruption between 2 and 3 million years ago. However, the last known lava flow occurred at the south end of Koussi approximately 12,000 years ago, give or take. But notice how it is positioned directly along the path of the catastrophic water erosion. In fact, it appears to cut right through this 12,000-year-old lava flow right there at the south. You can literally notice the line of a path that the water took and essentially eroded and erased the portions of that lava flow, which means that that flooding would have had to have happened after that flow of lava that is, by the way, scientifically documented to have occurred approximately 12,000 years ago.
Yes, but wouldn't that then have occurred after the Younger Dryas? I guess he could say that the striations were created immediately after the lava cooled, but that doesn't leave him much wriggle room.
And not only that, this white blemish within Koussi's caldera at 11,000 feet in elevation is not snow, it's salt. Salt that is said to be the remains of an ancient lake that disappeared just thousands of years ago. Gee, where on earth did that saltwater lake come from? As obviously it would have had to have formed after the volcano's original eruption and creation, which again was some 2-3 million years ago, which is way more recent than the 60 or so million years ago that's been claimed for the last time that water flowed through the Sahara, which tells us that something else, something separate, happened to the Sahara Desert far more recently that has seemingly evaded the scientific community.
It's good to see him acknowledge here the existence of salt lakes, which could not have existed during an arid period of the Sahara's history. But but he appears to think that salt lakes can only be formed from the remnants of oceans. But hopefully, if he's watching this, he knows now that salt lakes can form on their own. These salt lakes existed relatively recently.
But if that isn't smoking gun evidence enough, wait until you hear my third and final point of scientific evidence, which is nothing short of incredible. If there had been catastrophic ocean flooding through the Sahara, then it would certainly have pushed unfathomable amounts of debris and sediment out to the Atlantic Ocean, as that appears to be the path and flow of the flooding. So I did some investigating and I came across something very, very interesting, which is a study of the mapping of seafloor morphology off the coast of Mauritania. And get this, there is a massive seafloor slide called the Mauritania Slide, which I estimate from the legend on the lower right corner is at least 120 miles wide when going from north to south, and likely more than 400 miles wide when measuring from east to west. Make no mistake, this seafloor slide is unbelievably massive. And not only that, the seafloor sediment consists of stacked debris that measures at least a couple thousand meters, or just over a mile in depth. A truly astronomical amount of sediment. And this is the part that makes it so astoundingly interesting, which is the fact that the researchers of this study estimate that it is approximately 11,000 years old, and get this, is likely to have been created by a tsunami. The evidence is simply overwhelming that something extreme happened to the Sahara Desert far more recently than anyone thought possible, and the evidence is there for all who have eyes to see, or at least go looking for the information. And considering that it's been discovered in just the last several years that the Sahara Desert is not actually millions of years old as previously thought, it was actually a lush green tropical paradise with some of the largest freshwater lakes ever known to have existed, and also consisted of a massive network of rivers, until something happened between 11,000 and 5,000 years ago to turn it into the massive continental-sized desert as we know it today. So it seems reasonable to surmise that all of this is likely related to the same event, or if nothing else, is a missing piece of the puzzle. So this brings me back to the question, which is, what on earth would have had to have happened to create a tidal wave or a tsunami over the Sahara to create current ripples that are so exponentially larger than the already massive ones found at Camas Prairie in Montana?
Let me first say that I'm glad to see Corsetti in his later videos on the subject bringing in science papers, rather than simply appealing to media reports. And this paper, which I have read, is very interesting. And he has two things going for him with this one. First, the timing of the creation of the Mauritania Slide is about where it needs to be, approximately 11,000 years ago. And second, it suggests there could have been a tsunami at the time, though more study needs to be done. This is the best evidence he has presented yet, but please note that the date of the landslide, though rounded to 11,000 years ago, is more specifically dated to 10.5 to 10.9 thousand years ago. Remember that Corsetti wants this to have a date of 11.6 thousand years ago, so the timing is close, but not as close as he makes it seem. Is it possible that the event that created the Mauritania Slide complex, a submarine landslide off the coast, also destroyed a city at the Richat? It's more than 300 miles away, and it's on land. Seems far-fetched to me. How about you? Corsetti also makes reference to coincidences between the geological timing of the cataclysm and Plato's timing of the cataclysm. This is not evidence directly related to the Richat hypothesis, so much as to the Atlantis tale in general.
There is a book called The Adam and Eve Story, which was discussed in a secret CIA meeting some 50 years ago, and the book itself was not classified, as some have thought, but the reason why this book was discussed in a CIA meeting in the first place is still classified. But in that book, the author, Chan Thomas, described events that happen routinely on Earth that cause biblical levels of ocean flooding over entire continents. And look at the date on that. Identical to the 11,600 year date I've just been discussing, and keep in mind this book was written 50 plus years ago, so where it says 11,550 years ago is actually the same date today. But I mean, come on, what are the odds of that?
Well, let's calculate the odds. To calculate odds, you divide the probability of an event happening by the probability of it not happening. What is the probability that Chan Thomas would come up with the same date. Well, Chan Thomas got the idea from Plato. Priests of Egypt are supposed to have told Solon during his 10 years in Egypt, about 600 BC, that 9,000 years before that time there was a cataclysm which buried Atlantis beneath the ocean. Note that 9,000 plus 600 BC plus 1950 AD equals 11,550 years ago. The purpose of Chan Thomas's book is to try to prove Plato correct. So the probability that Thomas would have the same date as Plato is 100%. The probability that he would not have that date is 0%. Otherwise, the book would never have been written. So the odds are 1 to 0.
But if that's not overwhelming enough, the 11,600 year date is also the same exact timing of the Younger Dryas climate catastrophe that occurred 11,600 years ago and instigated what is referred to as meltwater pulse 1b. There was a sudden and rapid rise in global sea levels at the end of the last ice age, and again, 11,600 years ago. All of the dots connect here, and it's apparent for all who have eyes to see.
To be clear, meltwater pulse 1b was an accelerated rise in sea levels that is estimated to have occurred after the Younger Dryas period, beginning around 11,300 years ago and 11,500 years ago at the earliest estimate. Scientists are still debating on exactly how long of a period this occurred over, with some saying that it lasted for more than 1,000 years and the sea level rise was therefore very slow, and the most extreme paper saying it occurred over 300 years. But even that paper estimates that it rose 40 millimeters per year. Hardly a cataclysm and hardly exact timing with Plato. Sorry, Jimmy, but it just doesn't match. The biggest objection that both Alexander and Bright try to address is that there are no ruins of a civilization at the Richat structure.
But what about remnants of stone structures and buildings? Why haven't they found any of that? Well, unfortunately, nobody has actually gone looking. No heavy equipment has ever been brought to the Richat for excavation, nor has there ever been an archaeological dig, and for all we know, tons of evidence is buried just meters below the surface, which, let's not forget, is a massive area spanning nearly 15 miles across.
Okay, I suppose it's possible that something is there beneath the sands, but you'd expect that if there was a magnificent city there would be something poking out somewhere. And there isn't. In his third video, Bright points to something he found on Google Earth. He says this:
Look at this one located in the center island of the Richat. It almost looks like the outline of a castle or something. Perhaps there is a simple explanation for it, but I might be willing to pay several hundred US just to see a photo of what this looks like from the ground.
Okay, but is there any indication of the age of that, quote, castle, unquote? Tell us when it's from. Alexander implies that the structure itself is some kind of remains, or at least that it's not a natural formation. He says, ground observations could not provide consensus among researchers about the origins of the magnificent structure. Some scientists thought it was a massive impact crater, but the lack of shock-altered rock questions that theory. Others propose that it was formed by volcanic activity, like a volcano before eruption that ran out of energy and collapsed into itself. The debate of its formation rages on. This kind of presentation is often used by a non-specialist promoting an alternative hypothesis to the public. They'll point to the existence of more than one explanation as evidence that scientists can't come to an agreement. Scientists, like historians, are always proposing new theories. It's what they do. But Alexander is mistaken that there's no consensus on the Richat structure. It's true that there have been different hypotheses offered over the years, such as that the structure was created by an impact or even lightning strikes. But the general consensus is that it is of endogenic origin, that is, from beneath the earth. Fission track dating has indicated a date of origin in the Upper Cretaceous period, which would be between 100 and 66 million years ago. Bright acknowledges that the structure isn't man-made and that Atlantis could simply have been built upon it. So the origins of the structure are not all that important for our discussion, and we'll move on.
In their video, they show footage of many different artifacts that have been found in and around the Richat, including gold jewelry, arrowheads, even stone weights that resemble ones that are commonly used with fishing nets. They even found hundreds of stone spheres cut with unbelievable precision. All of these artifacts were found in and around the Richat at surface level, which again is in the middle of nowhere, proving that at some point in the distant past people did live there.
Alexander goes a step further. Some of those remnants are ancient stone spheres, which could have served an artillery function. They have a flattened side, so they can be stored without rolling about. You can assume that they were not used by some lone hunter, but kept in shelves in large numbers and used in organized warfare. It would have been a most effective method of defense. This type of artillery may have also been used in naval warfare. A lot of those stone spheres have been found in and around the Richat. This gives us further evidence for an ancient, sophisticated society in the area, with a proper military setup in place. So, merely from the existence of these unprovenanced stone spheres with a flattened side, Alexander is able somehow to extrapolate that they were cannonballs used on naval vessels of an advanced military society 11,000 years ago. Doesn't that sound to you a bit like reaching? Now, I can't speak as to when and where these artifacts came from, but neither can Bright nor Alexander. Where is the evidence for the date of these artifacts? I mean, when they come from is just as important as where they come from. Where's the appeal to archaeological provenance, or carbon dating, or seriation dating, or any of the other methods that scientists use to date artifacts? Nowhere does either Bright or Alexander present scientific evidence to support their conclusions. No scientific studies are cited, whether geological, archaeological, historical. They give the impression that they're simply spitballing. And since they don't refer to any past research done by geologists on the area, they're at the very least giving the appearance that they have little to no knowledge of the subject. Which is strange, because why would someone make a documentary before completing their research of a subject? What we should expect is a theory to be tested first, and then publication to follow. You don't make a documentary before you've completed your research. Alexander says the copper artifacts found in the area could be as old as Atlantis. How does he know this? Well, because, he says, copper has been used a long time. So the logic is, because copper usage could be old, these artifacts must be old. He doesn't go into the history of copper metallurgy in the area. He doesn't show evidence for the age of these copper artifacts. He just assumes. Not really the work of a scientist. If he knew that the earliest evidence of human use of copper in the world only goes back to 8000 BCE, then maybe he wouldn't have said anything. Recent work using thorough and systematic methods and taking into account all of the data done by an archaeometallurgist from the University of Arizona, Thomas Fenn, has indicated that copper trade in the Sahara did begin earlier than we thought. We used to think it began around the 7th or 8th century CE, but it turns out it goes all the way back to about 400 CE. Yeah, it's a little later than I'm sure Alexander would like to hear. Another piece of evidence Alexander presents has to do with the Dogon people, an ethnic group from the Mali region of West Africa. He says that the Dogon have scientific knowledge they must have gotten from an ancient advanced civilization. Alexander says, it is believed that for eons, the Dogon had known that Sirius was a binary star system, where two suns are orbiting around each other, Sirius A and Sirius B. Obviously, with the naked eye, this is impossible to notice. The Dogon further knew that it takes 50 years for one orbit to complete. You would need fine astronomical equipment to pick this up, which the Dogon certainly did not have. He appears to be getting his views from Robert Temple's book, The Sirius Mystery, published in 1976, but Temple got it from an earlier source. The idea that the Dogon people have unusual advanced knowledge goes back to the writings of a French anthropologist, Marcel Griaule, who studied the Dogon from 1931 until his death in 1956. In the first half of this period, until about 1948, Griaule's work was largely descriptive, and other anthropologists think his publications from this period are genuinely valuable. But in 1948, he published a book that made quite a splash among the general public. In this book, and in subsequent ones, he wrote about Dogon mythology, which he obtained from interviews he had with Dogon people. And he used this mythology and its symbols to try to extrapolate far-reaching conclusions about special knowledge and higher concepts the Dogon people had, which definitely raised some eyebrows. In 1965, after his death, another book was released, co-authored by Griol and his student Germain Dieterlen. Famous ancient astronaut theorist Eric von Daniken latched onto these works, especially the parts about the star Sirius and an ark that descended from heaven, to argue for the existence of ancient aliens. And of course, Robert Temple built upon this. So as you can see, Alexander's ideas are going back to Temple and von Daniken, who were drawing on Griol and Dieterlen. But in anthropology, as in other sciences, peer review and replication are important parts of the progress of knowledge, and so another study was done. You see, Griol's construction of Dogon culture was so far removed from what other anthropologists had found over the years in the region that a restudy was needed in order to figure out why his work was such an anomaly. So, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, a team led by Walter van Beek, consisting of members of various disciplines, including geography, physical anthropology, social anthropology, and archaeology, returned to the area in an attempt to replicate Griol's findings. Van Beek says that despite systematic attempts to replicate Griol's conclusions, what he found was contradictory to it. Among his findings, the Dogon know no proper creation myth, neither the version of Ogotameli, the person interviewed by Griol, nor that of the Renard Pale is recognizable to informants. The figure of Ogo, RP, is unknown. The fox, as a divining animal, has no privileged position in mythology. These are all parts of Griol's mythology. That Sirius is a double star is unknown. Astronomy is of very little importance in religion. Dogon society has no initiatory secrets beyond the complete mastery of publicly known texts. The supernatural world of the Dogon is more diverse and much more vague, ambivalent, and capricious than represented in DE or RP, Griol's books. The role of ancestors in Dogon religion is limited. They are not identified with other supernatural beings. The Binu cannot be considered ancestors and do not occupy a central position in mythology or ritual. The water spirit Nomo is not a central figure in Dogon thought and has none of the characteristics of a creator or a redeemer. Symbolism in Dogon religion is restricted and fragmented, carried by ideas and objects sometimes quite removed from the ones mentioned in Griol's writings. Now, of course, it could be said that just because Van Beek's team could not replicate what Griol had found, this doesn't automatically mean Griol was wrong. That's true, but it does mean that his findings so far have not been replicated. Moreover, keep in mind that Alexander is using Temple's ideas, not Griol's. According to Griol, the Dogon didn't believe that Sirius was merely a double star. He said they believed there was a third, smaller body there, too. And that doesn't check out. Alexander explains this discrepancy away by saying, "The Dogon knew that there are other objects in the Sirius star system much smaller than Sirius A and B. There is until now no conclusive scientific proof of its existence. Our technical equipment is as yet not advanced enough to confirm or deny this." So, he is willing to believe that the Dogon are right about the third star, and that scientists just haven't found it yet. But you can't establish the Dogon belief as in harmony with science by saying that science has yet to confirm their belief. Alexander also makes this statement. Further, the Dogon knew that the one star, Sirius B, is actually a white dwarf star. They describe the dwarf star as the smallest thing but also the heaviest. The Dogon description of this actually brings the matter to the point much better than our lengthy explanations. He credits the Dogon with knowing about white dwarf stars because they say that Sirius B is the smallest thing but also the heaviest. That's not the same as knowing what a white dwarf is. He tries to gloss over this by suggesting that their simple explanation is superior to a scientific one. Astronomer and astrophysicist Noah Broch points out in his book Sirius Matters that in 1893, an expedition of French astronomers stayed with the Dogon for 5 weeks in order to observe a solar eclipse. And so it is very possible that some transfer of astronomical knowledge from them to the Dogon could have occurred at this time. So even if the Dogon did pass on to Griol some accurate astronomical knowledge, it may have been something they learned recently. Alexander admits that scholars explain that some of the information that the Dogon and other tribes possess was obtained through cultural contamination, meaning they came in contact with travelers from Europe and picked up some of their ideas. In answer to this, Alexander says, however, there are other African cultures who have the same ancient knowledge about the star Sirius that was held long before the arrival of the white man and his telescopes in Africa. But he doesn't say who. What cultures? Where are the ones that show that they knew about it long before the arrival of the white man? I don't know of any documents from West Africa that come from before the arrival of the white man that say any such thing. So, what are you talking about? Alexander thinks that cultural contamination is far less plausible than that this ancient knowledge that the Dogon and other West African cultures may have may stem from a previously highly developed civilization 11,000 years ago. I guess 11,000 years of oral transmission of information is more reliable than 100 years of oral transmission. To his credit, Corsetti does not use Alexander's weak arguments about the indirect evidence about the Dogon to support the Richat hypothesis. In his fourth full-length video on the subject, he acknowledges the fact that there are no artifacts to establish that an advanced civilization once existed at the Richat, and he addresses the issue this way.
But people will say, if this was indeed the location of Atlantis, then where are the artifacts and remnants of destroyed buildings? Well, considering that the massive flooding stripped away the bedrock itself, that means that everything that would have been built above it would have been swept away along with that bedrock that once sat on top of. So here's a short clip of Mr. Carlson addressing this.
It does appear that there were extreme floods and fluvial erosion over the plateau that would have been ultimately responsible for exposing the core of this unique structure that would have been buried beneath, many hundreds of feet, maybe thousands of feet of bedrock at one time.
Clearly, if flooding occurred that was strong enough to strip bedrock, you're not going to remove the bedrock without removing everything else that was on top of it. It's the same concept of the so-called tablecloth trick, except that trick obviously wouldn't work in the case of catastrophic flooding. So if we're talking about removing hundreds and possibly even thousands of feet of bedrock, there would be no structures left to be found. In fact, it would have been swept away into the Atlantic Ocean, which plummets to depths exceeding 11,000 feet, or more than 3,400 meters, not far off the coast. Even the shallow-looking areas you see here are at depths of more than 1,000 feet, practically instantly off the coast of Africa. So any stone block from buildings would have been pummeled to pebbles long before then, and making it highly unlikely for anything to ever be found. But still, who knows what could be laying at unknown depths under the dirt in the area between the Richat and the Atlantic Ocean.
So Corsetti claims here that the tsunami was strong enough to eliminate every last remnant of this once great city. He does this on the authority of Randall Carlson. We would prefer to have a serious geological study that could back up this claim, especially because it seems so far-fetched. I mean, think about it. Tsunamis generally surge up to 10 or 20 miles inland on average. The distance from the coast to the Richat structure is more than 300 miles. The largest tsunami on record is the Lituya Bay, Alaska tsunami of 1958, which reached a height of 1,720 feet. And the maximum inundation distance on the flat ground near Fish Lake reached only 4,600 feet, which is less than a mile. So how high would the Richat tsunami have to be? Would it even be possible to reach 300 miles inland? And if it did, how strong would it be at the point of its farthest reach? It seems highly doubtful that it could pull all of the megaton stones from buildings, which people say Atlantis built with, and pummel them to pebbles, and then bring them all more than 300 miles back to sea. I'm sorry, but this idea just is too much to swallow. And it appears just to be a way to keep the mystery alive without having to bring any science in or to think about it too deeply. The thinking behind the Atlantis theory presented by Alexander and Bright is euhemerist. What is euhemerism? It's the belief that the stories about the gods, myths, are based on actual historical events involving real people. That is why, for example, he and Bright speak as though the god Poseidon and his mythical children were real people. In Visiting Atlantis, Rosen says, "Each culture has some form of mythology. Myth stems from legend, and legend from history. Often threads of truth are spread into the storytelling that makes up myths and legends." This statement expresses the euhemerist point of view. I have a full article on my blog on euhemerism and its fallacies, for which I will leave a link in the description below the video. But suffice it to say, for now, this statement is not borne out by the evidence. Myths and legends are differentiated by the fact that myths feature the gods and legends feature humans as the protagonists. They developed contemporaneously, so no, one did not lead to the other. Legends are stories that people tell about their past, and they often can have historical antecedents. But myths are an entirely different genre. Myths explain the origins of various things in nature, of various customs and practices. People can compose stories about the gods without those gods having to have existed. It is possible and even common for myths to be products of the human imagination. But even legends, which have a historical kernel of truth, need to be approached with some skepticism, right? They might feature actual historical figures or not. How do you tell what parts of legend are based in reality and what parts are not? You have to be very careful about that. And if you just accept them as a whole, like they're completely true, you're denying the fictional element of legend, which is definitely there. Is Atlantis a myth or a legend? Well, I called the Atlantis tale a myth. And that's because it features gods and demigods, but there aren't really any human protagonists in it. It speaks in generalities, and it explains how certain things came to be. So I think it falls neatly into the category of myth. Plus we know that Plato is likely to have made it up, though I do acknowledge that some people do call it a legend. As evidence that myths come from history, Alexander gives two examples of, quote, how history became legend and legend became myth, unquote. The two examples are the Trojan War and the Angkor or Khmer Empire. He says that these were myths that had proven to be true. Therefore, he asserts, myths do come from history. First of all, is it reasonable to assume that because two myths have been shown to be based on history, that therefore all myths are based on history? No, because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of myths from throughout the world, and the vast majority of them have never been shown to be based on history, and many of them are historically and scientifically impossible to be true. Moreover, his examples don't actually prove what he wishes them to prove. The Trojan War is a legend, not a myth, because although it has gods in it, the protagonists are humans. The Khmer Empire was neither a myth nor a legend. We just had villagers saying they knew of ruins in the jungle and people not believing them. That doesn't fit the definition of a myth or a legend. Now yes, the Trojan War legend proved to be based on a historical event. That is so. It is not the only legend that can be said about, but that doesn't make all legends real. Sure, we can entertain the possibility that a legend is based on history. Nothing wrong with that, as long as it fits history. But we shouldn't assume its truth from the get-go, and then try to make history fit it.
You want to hear another fascinating detail? So the legend of Atlantis states that it was an empire made up of 10 kingdoms, and the island of Atlantis was the capital. And the god Poseidon gave birth to 5 sets of twins, so 10 children, and each one of those children went on to rule each one of those 10 kingdoms. So allegedly, Poseidon had 5 sets of twins. Does anyone want to guess what part of the world has the highest birth rate of twins per capita? Nigeria. That is one interesting fact considering its geographical proximity to Mauritania and the Richat structure.
I mean, think about what he is suggesting here. People in Nigeria today have a higher birth rate for twins because they're descendants of Poseidon? Under the assumption that Atlas, the son of Poseidon and first king of Atlantis, was a real person, Bright suggests that he should be identified with an Atlas from another story, Atlas, the king of Mauritania. He then suggests that the Atlas Mountains, which are believed to be named for Atlas, the king of Mauritania, or vice versa, are to be connected with Atlantis.
One of Herodotus' notable achievements was developing what was then the most accurate mapping of the known inhabited world at the time of 450 BC. If you look to the left, what do you see there? That's right, the word Atlantis, which is shown to be located south of the Pillars of Hercules or the Strait of Gibraltar and positioned in northwest Africa. It just so happens to be in the exact location that is annotated on an ancient map that was created by who we refer to as the father of history. I mean, this is an X marks the spot if there ever was one.
First, I should point out that we don't possess any map made by Herodotus. The maps we find on the internet or in books that are said to be by Herodotus are modern maps, based on the descriptions in Herodotus' book. Not every modern interpretation of Herodotus is the same, so you'll see a bit of variety in these maps. But despite the title of Bright Insight's video, the ancient map he refers to doesn't exist. In Herodotus' book, the Atlantes refers to people who live in the area near the Atlas Mountains. In other words, they're called the Atlantes because they live near the Atlas Mountains. That's what these people put on the map, like the Garamantes and others here. These are all people that Herodotus says live in the area. Perhaps in response to my comments about the Herodotus map in the original version of this video, Corsetti made this addendum in his fourth video.
Some 2,500 years ago, he made a written detailed account of the known world at that time. However, he himself did not draw out this map. Others, and I do not know who or when, read through his various works and annotated that the people of Atlantis lived in this region you see here, which just so happens to be the same general location of the Richat structure. What are the odds of that?
I see nothing objectionable about the suggestion that there could be a connection between the Atlas Mountains, or the people called the Atlantes, and the city or island of Atlantis. That's a reasonable conclusion. I would even go so far as to say that the Eye of the Sahara could be one of the bases of the Atlantis legend. It's entirely possible that the ancient Greeks encountered it at some point in their travels. Perhaps a Greek explorer or trader. It's within the realm of possibility that the Richat structure was interpreted by these Greeks as the remains of an extinct city. I'd be willing to entertain any of those ideas, as I'm sure most historians would. But saying that the Richat structure was one of the inspirations for the Atlantis tale is not the same as saying it truly was Atlantis. In the sixth video, Corsetti brings another map into the discussion.
It is widely known that the ancient Romans were renowned for documenting everything, as the Caesars went to profound extent to accumulate knowledge and information from every location their vast empire ventured. So I have to admit that I was quite surprised to learn of someone by the name of Pomponius Mela, who was the Romans' first geographer dating back to some 2,000 years ago, and had created a sophisticated map of the known world at that time, titled The Habitable World of Pomponius Mela, something that up until recently I had never seen or heard of before.
The Pomponius Mela map is a modern reconstruction just as much as the one from Herodotus. Any map that he may have created has not survived until today.
Let's focus on this verifiably authentic 2,000-year-old map that has also annotated something very interesting in the Western Sahara Desert. First, notice that this map is oriented to the east in its original form, so let me go ahead and flip it to a north-south facing orientation so we can gain our bearing. And the features of Europe, West Asia, and North Africa become apparent. So let's now focus our attention to what is in the northwest region of the Sahara and observe what it annotates here. Atlantia, or Atlantiae, which more or less appears as Atlanteans, and again, in the same geographical region of the Richat structure.
The word Atlantae is simply the Latin equivalent of Atlantes in Greek. There's no new information here. I think everyone is in agreement that a people called the Atlantae lived here near the Atlas Mountains, but they were a people that lived in the present day for these geographers. These are not historical maps. They are contemporary maps. While the absence of the material remains of a great city in the region, and the distance of the site from the sea, and its failure to fit the description from Plato's writings are all major objections to this theory, there's more than that. This hypothesis requires the rejection of the scientific consensus on a number of points. That 12,000 years ago, humans were in the midst of the Stone Age, with no settlements larger than a few hundred people. Yet we hear Bright saying that at this time, Atlantis had a fleet of 1,200 warships. They had horse races, widespread trade and visitation, and the population of Atlantis was over 1 million people. 2. That urbanism first occurred around 3700 BCE in Mesopotamia after a long period of slow growth of the size of settlements. 8,000 years too late. 3. That the various technologies purported to exist in Atlantis, such as agriculture, iron smelting, horse riding, shipbuilding, artillery, writing, etc., had not yet been invented. 4. That the coastline of Africa was much as it is today at the end of the Younger Dryas. 5. That the elevation of Africa has not changed drastically in the last 12,000 years. 6. That the salt flats formed around the Richat structure are younger than the African humid period. 7. That sea level rise after the Younger Dryas was gradual. Now, Bright seems well aware that this theory contradicts most or all of these established facts.
And all of this has been building upon the videos I've been making since the beginning of this channel, which is that what we were taught in school about our true ancient past is far from it, and that we were far older and advanced than we ever thought.
He wants his viewers to reject all of these generally held ideas. But a good working hypothesis is not one that exists at the expense of so many other commonly accepted facts. If they want people to accept their hypothesis, they must first systematically dismantle all of these accepted facts in a convincing way. Only then could their hypothesis gain any traction. But until then, we can set aside this Atlantis theory as contradictory to both history and science. Thank you for watching. If you like what this channel is doing and want to help keep it alive, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/World of Antiquity, or give a one-time donation with a super thanks here on YouTube. You might like my little e-booklet, Why Ancient History Matters. It's designed to persuade people that the subject is important, even in the modern world. You might also wish to use it to help spread the word. So feel free to share it with someone you know. It's free for anyone who wants it. I've left a link in the description box below the video for you to grab a copy. Catch you later.